A lot of people know FromSoftware for two things: their high fantasy action RPGs like the Souls games and Elden Ring, and their mech games like the Armored Core series. But there is so much more to the developer than just those two types of games. And today we're going to look at some of their lesser known releases. I'm Matt from Hidden Machine, and these are the other FromSoftware games. Before we get too deep into things, I want to take a moment and thank our supporters over on Patreon. If you are in a position to help the channel grow, there's a link down below. And we've got channel memberships here on YouTube. Even $1 a month over on Patreon goes a long way to help us out. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to Hidden Machine. We've got a huge backlog of deep dives and other videos for you to check out. And, a little like and a comment wouldn't hurt either while you're at it. So help us out if you like it. If not, dislike. Just give us the interaction, all right? You know what I'm saying. Anyway, enough of the plugs. Let's get into the meat of the video, the other FromSoftware games. Now, with the release of Armored Core 6, a lot of folks are going to be getting into their very first Armored Core game, especially a lot of people who have become fans of FromSoftware through the Souls games or Elden Ring or any of the other games in between. Now, the Armored Core series goes all the way back to 1997, and between the mainline releases, the spin-offs, and the remasters, there have been over 20 Armored Core releases through FromSoftware. The Souls games and their various spin-offs are obviously some of the most popular FromSoftware releases in recent times, but the company actually released over a dozen mech games before 2009's Demon Souls. So for many longtime fans, Armored Core is actually a return to form for the developer, after a nearly decade-long break from releasing any new mech games. So we've got those Souls games, and the roots of those go all the way back to 1994's Kingsfield, which was the first FromSoftware developed game, and we've also got the mech games, of which there are many. But there are also a lot of other games that I don't think fit into either of those two categories, but I'd like to take a look at them. And to be clear, we're talking about games developed by FromSoftware, not just published by. They've published a lot of other games, but we're focusing on the ones that they actually made. Now, these other games that I want to talk about today don't seem to get too much coverage here in the West, and that's partly because a lot of the games are Japanese exclusives, but also, I think that the Souls games have really overshadowed a lot of other stuff that has been accomplished by FromSoftware. And beyond that, a lot of these games did not review very well. And that doesn't mean I want to write them off as bad games, not by any means. I mean, if we go all the way back to the 2008 demo for Demon Souls, the then president of Sony Entertainment called it an unbelievably bad game. This led to Sony deciding to not publish the game in the West, a decision that they would soon come to regret. Instead, the North American publishing was licensed out to Atlas West, now known as Atlas USA. While it was met with poor sales and poor reviews in Japan, the game wound up connecting with North American players. The Demon Souls servers were only intended to stay online for about 2 years, but due to the success of the game, they stayed active for 9 years. This unbelievably bad game is now considered by many to be one of the best and most influential games of all time. It defined the Souls-like genre, and it went on to win several Game of the Year awards. I don't necessarily think that there are any other Game of the Year type games hiding out in the FromSoftware back catalog, but it is apparent that timing and perspective have a lot to do with how these games are perceived. The combat system in Demon Souls at the time was perceived by some as being unfinished and broken, but other people have gone on to see that game as being nearly perfect. So, given the recent string of successes that FromSoftware has seen through their unapologetic approach to game design, I thought this was a perfect time to look back on their history. And going forward, any games I cover will be relatively spoiler-free. I'll be taking footage from early gameplay and gameplay trailers, just as a heads up. And I do want to clarify, these are only games that FromSoftware has developed. They've published a lot of other games that I'm not covering here, a lot of oddballs that you wouldn't expect from them necessarily, but these are just games developed by FromSoftware. In playing and checking out all these games, I've noticed that a lot of FromSoftware games feature elements that recall other FromSoftware games. Sometimes it's in the graphics or music, sometimes you'll see recurring characters or enemy archetypes, and other times you'll find items like the Moonlight Greatsword that appear in a bunch of different games. So, while they all seem to share some DNA, potentially, for the sake of this video, I'm going to break things down into a few different basic categories. Firstly, the Mech Games. FromSoftware's Mech Games include all of the Armored Core games, as well as Frame Grid, Renegade Mech Pursuit, Metal Wolf Chaos, the Another Century's Episode games, Chrome Hounds, and Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn. Each of these games has their own take on the mech genre, but in general they consist of big robots flying or running around and battling other big robots. Honestly, I'm not the best person to talk about these titles because I'm really bad at most of them, but I'm also just trying to cover games that don't fit into this or the Souls genre, and that Souls genre is the second main category. I'm gonna also include the Souls games' predecessors here. So we've got the Kingsfield series, Shadow Tower, Eternal Ring, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 through 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, and Elden Ring. We're not gonna talk too much about these games, but for the sake of context, I wanna give a little history on how we got to where we are with the Souls genre. I already mentioned their very first game, Kingsfield, which hit the PlayStation back in 1994. Kingsfield is a first-person action RPG, and like many of the other FromSoftware games that would come after it, it's pretty hostile toward newcomers. Despite that, the game still found commercial and critical success, and it was followed up with 3 sequels. These games feature many elements and themes that would later appear in the Souls games, and it's really neat to look back at them and see that this style has been honed and refined for nearly 30 years, resulting in universally acclaimed games like Elden Ring. That said, Kingsfield is a very early 3D first-person game, and as such, I believe that most gamers today will find it pretty difficult to acclimate to the controls. Iron Pineapple has an awesome video on Kingsfield, which is great for people like me who just couldn't finish the game, but want to see more of it. After the first 2 Kingsfield sequels, the mechanics and tone of Kingsfield were applied to 1998's Shadow Tower. This is a common practice for FromSoftware. They'll often opt to do a spiritual successor or a game heavily influenced by a previous title, rather than developing outright sequels to most of their games. Shadow Tower influenced 2000's Eternal Ring for the PS2, and in 2003, FromSoftware released Shadow Tower Abyss, which is notable for throwing guns into the mix. Demon Souls took the foundation laid by these first-person games and built on it in a third-person view. Each of those first-person games iterated on the ones that came before them, and as we continue to look at more FromSoftware games, you'll see that iteration process over and over again. But enough about those games, let's get into the other categories. First up, we have what I think are more traditional action games. The early 2000s brought on a huge wave of third-person, hack-and-slash, 3D action-type games like Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, and Onimusha. You can definitely see the influence of these games on the Souls games, but Souls games do utilize a more nuanced and methodical system across combat and character upgrades. The FromSoftware games that I would put into this more traditional action category include Spriggan, Lunar Verse, Otogi, Otogi 2, The Story of Hiro Yoshitsune, and Ninja Blade. Spriggan, Lunar Verse was released for the PlayStation 1 back in 1999, and it's based on a manga called Spriggan. This game came out well before the mechanics and controls of the 3D action genre began to coalesce around the standards set in games like Ninja Gaiden, and as such, it can feel a little awkward to control. The game predates analog sticks, so you have to move around using the D-pad, and use the bumpers and triggers to strafe left and right or angle the camera up and down. The game doesn't have an English translation, but that's not as much of a problem here as it will be in some other games. As you complete missions and progress in the game, you're able to level up your character and equip different weapons and armor. It's a really progressive game that can be very rewarding if you have the patience for the controls and lack of localization. Otogi, Myth of Demons, and its sequel, Otogi, Immortal Warriors, were released for the Xbox in 2002 and 2003, with each game hitting North America about a year after the Japanese releases. These are hack-and-slash games with some RPG elements. The games were definitely a sign of things to come, and contain a lot of those signature FromSoftware quirks in their systems and overall difficulty. Contemporary reviews of the first Otogi game were largely favorable, and in 2003, GameSpot nominated it as a finalist in their Best Game No One Played awards category. The sequel got a similar response, with generally good review scores, but pretty low sales. These games are both Xbox exclusives, and I do think they're still available on Xbox through the backwards compatibility system, but it would be great to see them come to PC or PlayStation, especially since they can't really reliably be emulated right now. The Story of Hiro Yoshitsune is a Japanese exclusive that was released for the PS2 in 2005. The game is somewhat similar to something like Dynasty Warriors, with a bit of real-time strategy stuff mixed in. You have a crew of fighters that you can give commands to as you make your way across different battlefields. Unfortunately, while this game can be emulated, I wasn't able to find any sort of translation patch, and it appears to be pretty story and dialogue heavy. The gameplay is really smooth, especially for the time, so if you don't mind everything being in Japanese, I would suggest seeking this one out. Rounding out the action games category, we have Ninja Blade. This one hit the Xbox 360 and Windows in 2009 and 2010. In April of 2022, the game was delisted from Steam. But you can still purchase legitimate keys through some retailers, like Green Man Gaming. I originally started playing this game for a different video, but it wasn't very easy to get up and running. The game is plagued by technical issues, and it definitely requires a few fixes to play it on modern PCs. The gameplay builds on the Otogi series, but it adds the sort of QTE-based cinematic sequences that were all too common at this time. The game was engineered to appeal to a wider audience, and it shows. FromSoftware worked with Microsoft to create the game's protagonist, Ken Ogawa. It's got a lot of big and flashy set pieces interspersed with the classic Xbox 360 era hack-and-slash action. Ninja Blade is very much a product of its time, maybe even more so than a lot of the other games that we're going to cover here. It received very positive reviews upon release, with GamePro giving it a perfect score and naming it Game of the Month in June of 2009. However, it was another FromSoftware title that wound up being nominated for Best Game That No One Played. If I'm being entirely honest, I found the game to be a little too repetitive and punishing for my tastes. But I also skipped this entire generation of games, so I don't really have a lot of affection for most of these mid to late 2000 action tropes that appear in games like this. But if you have a fondness for this era of action games, Ninja Blade may be a hidden gem. The next category we have is turn-based RPGs. First up, Enchanted Arms, which came to the Xbox 360 and the PS3 in 2005. This is basically FromSoftware attempting a more traditional JRPG. It's going to look very familiar to fans of that genre. You have a 4-person party which engages in turn-based combat that takes place on a grid. It received pretty mixed reviews at the time, and modern reviews are equally mixed. The Xbox 360 version allows you to unlock a character from the Metal Wolf series, which is a pretty cool Easter egg. Unfortunately, I couldn't track down a copy of this to try for myself, but there is a good amount of coverage on the game all over the internet. Kingsfield Additional 1 is a PSP game that came out in 2001, with a sequel, the aptly titled Kingsfield Additional 2, released in 2004. These games were exclusive to Japan, and while they bear the Kingsfield name, they don't play like Kingsfield games at all. These are very old school style RPGs, which consist of you visiting a town, talking to people, entering a dungeon, exploring that dungeon in the old step-by-step first-person view, engaging in turn-based combat with various monsters, finding some loot, and then returning to the town to repeat the process. The music includes some remixed versions of songs from other Kingsfield games, but that's probably the closest thing that these titles have in common with the main series. The art is pretty great in my opinion, but it's pretty much void of any animation, and it winds up looking more like a visual novel most of the time. I couldn't find anyone online advocating for these games, but there are full translations available for both of them if you want to try it out for yourself. Kingsfield Additional 2 also had a neat feature where you could import your character from the first game, including all of their gear and stats. The next category is card battlers, and there's two main ones here. There's Lost Kingdoms 1 and Lost Kingdoms 2, both of which are Japanese exclusives for the GameCube, released in 2002 and 2003. Neither of these games saw great reviews, but they were seen as decent games at the time. They have a unique battle system where the player controls the protagonist in real-time battles, but you attack through the use of cards. That means you'll be moving around to avoid enemies, but you don't attack directly. Instead, each card that you use summons a monster, either as a sort of quick attack that happens on the spot, or as a temporary companion that will aid you in your battle. There was also a multiplayer feature that allowed players to go head-to-head against one another. Cards are leveled up when you use them to defeat enemies, and those leveled up cards can transform into different cards. FromSoftware would revisit the card battler concept in 2004's Kuon, but I'd argue that Kuon fits better into the survival horror category, so we'll come back to that one a bit later. Next, we've got puzzle games, and in 2007, FromSoftware co-developed two very traditional puzzle games for the Nintendo DS. I'm honestly not sure how to pronounce either of these, but one is Sudoku and the other is Picross, and neither one seems to have many fans. In 2008, FromSoftware developed Shadow Assault Tenchu, which was a pretty big departure from the long-running Tenchu series of stealth action games. This one is more akin to an action-based puzzler like Bomberman, where the player moves on a grid and sets traps to defeat enemies. It was an Xbox Live Arcade game released for the 360, and it's currently still available online. It received very average reviews at the time, but most modern reviews I can find tend to see the game in an even less positive light, although I think that might be because the game is such a huge jump from the previous Tenchu titles. That series started in 1998, and FromSoftware bought the license from Activision in 2004. 2019's Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice was actually originally conceived as a new Tenchu game, but it wound up outgrowing that concept during development. The Adventures of Cookie and Cream is a puzzle platformer that was released in Japan for the PS2 in the year 2000, and it came to other regions the following year. It also got a Nintendo DS port in 2007. The game features a split screen where each character has a path before them, and the characters have to work together to help one another reach their destination. There are a bunch of different courses to complete, which increase in difficulty as you progress, and there are also some boss fights along the way. While this game is clearly geared toward co-op, it can be played by a single person as well. An interesting feature is that you can play the two-player mode with one controller, having each person use one half of the gamepad. There's also a versus mode if you just can't get enough of that puzzle platforming. As far as FromSoftware games go, this is definitely a change of pace in terms of tone, but it still presents a formidable challenge, and it's widely regarded as being a pretty solid co-op game. Now, before we get into the final category of survival horror, I've got a few titles that I felt didn't really fit neatly into any of the other categories that I picked. And these categories are totally made up by me. It doesn't matter. If you got your own picks and you can cram these ones into some other list, go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter. These are just the other games of the other FromSoftware games, according to me. Let's get into it. Evergrace, released in the year 2000 for the PS2, is an action RPG. It was one of 3 FromSoftware games to be North American launch titles for the PlayStation 2, which also included Armored Core 2 and Eternal Ring. The game has 2 different campaigns, and it plays like a traditional action RPG with a few twists. You don't get experience points. Instead, sometimes enemies drop these red fruits, which allow you to increase your stat points. Your character has a stamina bar, and the strength of your attacks is dictated by how much stamina you have at the time of attacking. However, running around decreases stamina, which gives the combat a very deliberate pace, as you'll be constantly juggling between offensive and defensive actions that are both draining your stamina. On top of that, your stamina bar will replenish faster depending on how low your health is, which allows for some interesting risk and reward scenarios. You can find a lot of different equipment for your characters, and that gear will wear down with use over time. The game definitely has a lot in common with the later third-person Souls games that FromSoftware would eventually make, but in my opinion, it's different enough to not totally fit that mold. Evergrace 2 would hit the PS2 in Japan 1 year later, and that game would be released as Forever Kingdom in North America in 2002. Evergrace 2 is actually a prequel, and it allowed players to freely switch between 3 different characters while playing. This game put a heavier focus on equipment, and it got rid of stuff like the skill point fruits and the stamina-based battle system. Overall, it feels a little bit more focused and traditional in terms of being an RPG than the first game. I tried to do some research on it, but I couldn't figure out why they chose to rename the game outside of Japan. Maybe they were hoping a name change would help it perform better? If you've got any insight on that, please let me know down in the comments. 2003 saw the release of Thousand Land. This game is an Xbox title that was released exclusively in Japan. The game is unique. It's a strategy game where you start with a blank grid representing a piece of land, and then you place different objects on that grid. You're basically creating a battlefield with different types of structures, weapons, and terrain. When the time comes, you'll have a number of characters that you can set to either offense or defense, and they'll go ahead and do their thing, engaging in battle against an opposing group of characters who are coming in from an opposing battlefield. In 2019, a full translation patch was released, so if you want to try this one for yourself, now you can. In 2009, FromSoftware developed a game that I can't pronounce, but it's a visual novel for the Nintendo DS based on an actual novel that was released in Japan in 1950. You take on the role of a detective who is on the trail of a serial killer. The novel had been adapted into 2 films before this game came out, and it seems like a fairly well-loved story in Japan, but this game never came to any other regions. There are branching paths which allow you to develop a story that's different from the original novel, and the game has a cool black and white art style. I struggled to find much coverage on this game, and I couldn't find a copy for myself to check out, but the few reviews I could find were very favorable. 2009 also saw the release of Yatsu Hakamura, which is another Nintendo DS game exclusive to Japan. And it's another detective story with a very similar art style. And it's another game that I really couldn't find much information about. Monster Hunter Diary Poka Poka Iru Village is another Japanese exclusive, this time for the PSP. The game came out in 2010, and a version for the Nintendo 3DS was released in 2015. The game is about a cat village, and while it looks a lot like Animal Crossing, it does have some unique features. You do some village building, some quests, various mini-games and activities, and then you send your cat people out on expeditions to hunt monsters in the Monster Hunter style, and you gather more valuable resources. While most of the game is controlled in a very traditional manner, the expeditions are a bit different. You don't directly control the characters, you give them commands to attack or retreat or jump and avoid attacks and do stuff. It's kind of neat. There was an expansion to the game that was released in 2011, and at some point there was also a Hello Kitty crossover event. This one stands out to me as one of the most unexpected FromSoftware developed games, and it's a real shame that it never made its way out of Japan. 2012 brought us Steel Battalion Heavy Armor. This is a game that requires the use of Kinect motion controls to play, and it's a sequel to a 2002 game that required the use of a custom-made 44-button controller. The idea here is to really immerse the player in the role of piloting a giant two-legged tank-like mech called a vertical tank. For anyone who wasn't around at the time, the Kinect was not very popular, and Heavy Armor hoped to remedy this, being marketed as the first hardcore Kinect game. Unfortunately, the overly complex controls did not mesh well with the Kinect, and reviewers consistently pointed out that the game was just too difficult to control. Even under the most optimal conditions, following every single suggestion in the manual, it's very easy for a player to have a lot of difficulty just getting around in this one. Personally, this is the kind of game that I would love to see in VR, especially because most reviews at the time applauded the concept and the overall ambitiousness of the game, as well as the graphics, story, and characters. The two previous Steel Battalion titles reviewed fairly well, so I think that in the right hands, this series could make a positive comeback, maybe in VR, but the Kinect and FromSoftware, unfortunately, were not a winning combination. Now, speaking of VR games, the last game in this Others category is 2018's Deracine? Listen, this is another game where everybody on YouTube has their own way to pronounce it, and I don't know what's correct. But it's a PSVR game for the PS4. It's a first-person adventure game where you play as a fairy exploring a boarding school. There's this interesting time mechanic where you can take time away from an item and then give it to another item, breathing new life into that thing. Almost every review that I found on this game mentioned that mechanic, and then they went on to mention how much of a shame it was that it was barely ever used. As a fairy, you can't interact directly with the people in the game. Instead, you have to use your fairy wits to find more indirect ways to communicate with people. You'll also explore memories and use the clues they provide you to find new items and progress the story. Overall, it's a much more calm and quiet game than most of the other FromSoftware releases. And while it got a very mixed response from critics, it does seem like there's a lot to appreciate here. The final category today is survival horror, and there are 4 main games that I'd like to cover. The first one being Echo Night. Released for the PS1 in 1998, this is a first-person survival horror game, and it uses a control scheme somewhat similar to the Spriggan game that I mentioned earlier. You play as a man named Richard, who is exploring different scenarios that are triggered by different items found in your father's house. Basically, you go around interacting with ghosts, and your goal is to help them move on in one way or another, which in turn helps you to progress your story. There isn't any combat in this game. Instead, if you encounter a hostile ghost, you need to find a way to turn the lights on, which will dispel the ghosts. I actually wound up really enjoying my time with this one. It has a very slow pace and it's sort of awkward, but there's also this undeniable charm to the whole thing, and it's a relatively short game that can be completed in well under 4 hours. There are several sequels to Echo Night. Echo Night 2 is a Japanese exclusive that came out in 1999. It's fairly similar to the first game. You again play as a man named Richard, but this game takes place in its own timeline, separate from the events of Echo Night 1. I haven't played this one for myself yet, but there is a fan translation patch available online. Echo Knight Beyond came to the PlayStation 2 in 2004, and this one got around outside of Japan. It's a bit different from the first two games. Instead of turning on lights to clear out the ghosts, you have to turn on a ventilation system. The game takes place in a large abandoned research center in outer space. It also has a timeline separate from the first two games, but you do still get to play as a man named Richard. This Richard is a newlywed who was with his wife on their way to a honeymoon on the moon. All of these games feature multiple endings, which are achieved through finding different items or performing different actions as you play through them. If you're a fan of that first wave of 3D survival horror games, especially the ones that came out for the PS1, I think you might have a lot of fun with this series. In 2005, FromSoftware released an application for the PSP called Adventure Player, which gave people the tools they would need to create their own visual novels and adventure games for the platform. It came with 3 sample games, one of which was Echo Knight: The First Voyage, which takes place on the same ship that you visited in the first game, although this game tells its own story. Another sample game, which I think is called Kaikiken, it's a spooky visual novel that does have an English translation. And as for the third game, Hako no Naka, it's something that I can't find much info on. I saw a forum post that described it as a mysteriously rendered 3D game similar to Echo Knight, but that it would take about 17 to 20 hours to complete. I can't even find a screenshot of this one, so if you've got any info on these Adventure Player sample games, please drop me a line and let me know. I'm really curious about them. Finally, we come to Kuon, which is probably their most traditional survival horror game. This came to North America and Japan for the PS2 in 2004, and it hit Europe in 2006. It deals with a monster outbreak outside of a large Japanese manor, and I think this game takes place in maybe the year 900 or so. You've got a lot of monsters and ghosts influenced by Japanese folklore, and it's got a really unique vibe and feel overall. The card battler thing is sort of present here, but instead of being an actual card battler, you just use cards as ammunition for your attacks. The campaign has you take control of 3 different protagonists. Overall, the response to this game was pretty mixed. People liked the atmosphere and the vibe, but the controls and gameplay leave a lot to be desired. You can kind of just spam attacks and then run away and heal yourself. There's a self-healing button, which kind of makes the survival horror aspect of the game feel a little moot. You don't really have a scarcity of resources like in most survival horror games, when you can just heal yourself at any time. Still, I had a lot of fun exploring this game and just seeing what it had to offer. It's surprisingly grim, and it's a really cool take on that PS2 era survival horror type game, similar to something like Silent Hill 2, but it's definitely got its own Japanese FromSoftware twist that really makes it stand out against other games of the era. Although it is... I want to love this game, but I can't. I think that's the easiest way to say it. It's kind of a shame. I didn't save the best for last. It's a good game. It's a really interesting game, and I'm sure it has a lot of fans out there. It's a scary game, but it's got a lot of flaws. But hey, a lot of games have a lot of flaws, and we talked about a lot of games today. And really, I have no more games to talk about today, so I'll be honest, I've been trying to record this video for the better part of like 5 hours. I've had every type of technical difficulty that you can imagine, from camera overheating, memory card corrupting, microphone not working, camera not working, losing power, rain. It's really hot in here. So thanks for bearing with me. Sorry if my voice is a little hoarse tonight. I've been talking for a really long time, and with that, I'm gonna get out of here. So thanks for hanging out. Let me know, what did you think of these games? Are there any games that were totally new to you? Have you played any of these games? Did I miss any games? let me know about those other From Software games. We all love the Souls, we all love the Mech Games, but what about the other stuff? Let's talk about it down below, or meet me in the Hidden Machine Discord. There's a link in the description. Until next time, see ya!